So I talked with JP Lindsey recently on the channel. JP Lindsey has been covering the war from inside Ukraine since just about the start of the full-scale invasion from major metropolitan areas like Kiev and Kharkiv, etc. He recently went on Matt Gaetz' program on OAN, One America News Network, to talk about the recent massive Ukrainian drone operation, Operation Spiderweb, which decimated the Russian bomber fleet in a way that's been particularly bothersome for the commanders in Moscow behind the walls of the Kremlin. Now, I remember talking to him about the fact that trying to make these appeals to people who I don't believe fundamentally agree with a lot of the values that underpin the Ukrainian cause, whether it be Ukrainian sovereignty, whether it be defense of their institutional democracy, whether it be I mean, even I think like some areas you can maybe find some sympathy with talking about how Christians are treated in occupied territory, but that because of how much gunk has been published from alt media on the MAGA right, and with how they have been Ukraine bashing for so long, that you're going to have to, at some point, appeal to fundamental principles that I don't believe is that important to much of the movement because it's not important to Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is willing to completely disregard the US Constitution, reject the results of a democratic election, go after the press by restricting, broadcasting licenses and stuff like this, there's certain values that you're not going to be able to appeal to. So if you're going to get them, you're going to have to appeal to certain recourse concerns or appeal to Trump like a businessman where Ukraine is just a better investment. Appealing to them off the credibility of the United States, upkeeping its agreements is not going to work. Upholding, Ukraine's freedom is not going to work. The appeal to sovereignty is not going to work. Even the appeal to them giving up their atomic weapons as a sacrifice, I don't think is going to make much progress in these spaces. And so JP Lindsey went on Matt Gaetz's program. Of course, he is a pro-Trump congressman that Trump picked to be the top legal mind in the country when he had nothing more than a small record in the private practice. Before that was rejected due to just much of the people on the Hill despising the man due to his interpersonal behavior, but also ongoing allegations of his participation in the full, I don't know how to put it, but the participation in a trafficking of a underage girl, whether he solicited their services as some online digital payments indicate or not. Matt Gaetz has yet to admit to, or he just continues to deny. So that's what ended up sinking him. And now that's why he's a TV broadcaster on OAN. And now I wanted to see if JP Lindsey could have really had any success here, because I do have something from after this interview took place that I think indicates that, yeah, you have a long, tall hill to climb.
In a significant escalation of the ongoing conflict, Ukraine has launched a large-scale drone attack against Russian air bases, targeting strategic bombers and military infrastructure. At the same time, Ukraine and Russia are engaged in a second round of peace talks in Istanbul, Turkey, aiming for some sort of ceasefire and addressing humanitarian concerns. But with these drone attack exchanges back and forth, we really doubt that the Istanbul talks were engaged in earnest. Yesterday, Ukraine executed Operation Spider's Web, a meticulously planned drone offensive targeting these 5 Russian air bases. The operation involved 117 drones launched from concealed positions within Russia. It resulted in the...
I would also say the fact that the planes that were bombed were already loaded in missiles, which you can see from the video, to bomb Ukrainian cities, would also indicate to me that those bombers were not ready to negotiate in earnest either. And again, when we say negotiate in earnest, there's been no earnest negotiations for the entirety of this process. The Russians continue to put forward maximalist demands. At what point did the Ukrainians say, okay, we have to disable these planes that are firing at our cities if the West is not going to provide us with the air defense systems to protect our cities? As Ben Hodges, one of the NATO generals that helped train Ukrainian forces post-2014, put it, it's a lot cheaper to take out the Archer than it is to continuously taking out the Arrow.
destruction or damage of over 40 military aircraft, including some of the key features of the Russian bomber fleet and their radar planes.
That's interesting that Matt Gaetz just kind of took the Ukrainians' numbers at face value, isn't it? I might even tell, like, Mr. Matt Gaetz, maybe you should be a little bit less of a Ukrainian problem. Maybe you should just say Ukrainian claim. Did he say Ukraine claims?
In Russia. It resulted in the destruction or damage of over 40 military.
No, he just takes the SBU words at face value, even before they released the more complete footage, which shows the majority of those damaging or destruction of aircraft confirmed. Huh. You know, I'm starting to believe that Matt Gaetz might be the ghost of Kiev.
Military aircraft, including some of the key features of the Russian bomber fleet and their radar planes. Ukrainian officials estimate the damage at approximately $7 billion, significantly impacting Russia's strategic bomber fleet. President Vladimir...
Again, that is like the ceiling of how much damage was done. The range of predictions I've seen go from 2 billion to 7 billion. Again, I mean, at least that time he said the Ukrainians estimated.
Zelensky personally oversaw the operation, which took 18 months to plan and execute, according to Ukrainian sources. Now, in response to Ukraine's drone offensive, Russia launched its largest combined drone and missile attack of the war, deploying over 400 drones against Ukrainian targets. These strikes resulted in significant casualties and infrastructure damage. Additionally,
I think it's kind of important to note the fact that those strikes in Sumy, when you say casualties, civilian casualties, where the strikes on the airplanes destroyed military aircraft. I think that's important for a journalist to distinguish.
a Russian missile strike on Ukrainian training areas killed 12 soldiers and injured 60. This led to the resignation of the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, who cited his own personal responsibility for the battlefield loss. Amid the ongoing conflict, leaders from Poland, Romania, and Lithuania reaffirmed their support for Ukraine's future NATO membership during a summit in Lithuania. Now, this is odd because it stands in direct contrast to President Trump's statements. He said,
Why? That's weird. That's odd. That's odd that these Eastern European nations that have the most possibly on the line when it comes to their futures say that they still want Ukraine in NATO. That's weird. Did they remember to check their foreign policy with the president? They're different countries. They have their own beliefs.
That the United States...
That isn't odd at all if you know about Eastern European history.
States' backing for Ukraine's NATO bid ultimately contributed to the start of the war. And we tend to believe President Trump's instincts are correct and on point on this very matter. So will the sudden and stark increase in hostilities give each side...
Again, it's always NATO expansion started the war. They don't delve at all into Russian history. Or listen to Putin himself, who makes tons of speeches about why Ukraine is like an irremovable part of Russia. If it's an irremovable part of Russia, then whether or not NATO was there, like if they just had an independent foreign policy from the Kremlin, that could have led to an invasion. Of course, talking about alternative history scenarios, we can't calculate exactly what the Russians were going to do, but is the conclusion really that an empire that for the entirety of its history led by an imperialist to always expand westward has now decided never mind because of the, you know, if NATO didn't exist, they would say, nope, you know what, Russia doesn't have to exist as an empire anymore. We don't need a sphere of influence.
A reason to end the war, or will it make both sides believe they should keep fighting? Joining us now, independent Ukraine war journalist JP Lindsey. JP, you're speaking to us tonight from Ukraine. What are you seeing and experiencing?
Hey, Congressman Matt, this is I've been reporting in Ukraine every single day since 2022, since February 24th, 2022. So I've seen a range of events and emotions during these past 3.5 years. And, you know, so people have learned not to be overly jubilant, but there is a sense of pride in what Ukraine achieved on Sunday. And I think, you know, from my perspective here in Ukraine, I think some of the stories that get missed here, I mean, we have what happened on Sunday. Ukraine took out 1/3 of the Russian Air Force. And, you know, having been here this entire time, I've been in places like Kharkiv, 30 miles.
That's not true. I don't. What? That's not true. They didn't. I mean, he might be saying that for the cameras. Um, Even at if you accept the Russian numbers at face, I mean, the Ukrainian numbers at face value, which you shouldn't if you're an independent journalist. But if you do accept the Ukrainian numbers completely at face value, then that's 1/3 of the bomber fleet, not 1/3 of the Russian Air Force.
From Russia under so many bombings and attacks, missile attacks. And so to know that these very planes that rained hell upon Ukraine for 3 years, a third of them have been destroyed in one Sunday afternoon, is pretty extraordinary for Ukrainians. And another little irony there, Sunday was June 1st, and June 1st, 1996, was the day that Ukraine, as a result of that Budapest memorandum organized by Clinton, for which he later apologized, June 1st, 1996 was the day that Ukraine gave up a lot of its bombers to Russia. So the bombers that have been attacking Ukraine these past 3 years used to be Ukrainian until the Clinton administration forced Ukrainians to give them up. And so Ukraine was finally, with this operation, able to destroy.
So the way JP Lindsey does a lot of these interviews on like conservative networks or in conservative circles is usually by just aiming as much of the blame as possible at Democrats, because at this point, as we've seen from Scott Pressler, as we've seen from Jack Posobiec, as we've seen from a bunch of people in MAGA world, a lot of people just associate Ukraine with the Democrats, like a one-to-one line. Scott Pressler even directly made that accusation today that the Ukrainians are specifically organizing their war effort around the American midterms, which is pretty ridiculous. But that's the type of stuff that they're throwing out there, and they actually believe that they're just going to turn this war with its own independent history, with many different motivations, into just like another partisan wedge issue. And so I think that the strategy JP has is like, well, you know, if it's just being turned into a partisan wedge issue, then it would really suck if you showed up Biden by winning the war that he lost, you know, which I get the strategy, but I also want to make sure that, like, you know, when you put those, I understand you talk to a certain audience, but you got to also, as a journalist at this point, if you're not acknowledging the failures of Donald Trump openly and dealing with this process and how he's been worse than literally every single other U.S. president in dealing with the Russians, definitely since aggression. And I mean, he's been worse than Obama. I mean, he's been worse than Biden, and he's been worse than Clinton. I'm not saying that lightly, because I think they all failed in different ways. Obama and Clinton probably the most severely of the Democrats. But, you know, it just, for me, it's a show for them. It's a show for the audience here at OAN, trying to see if you can be like, actually, guys, the deep state loves Russia. I don't know.
Destroy, again, a third of the Russian Air Force. And another important thing to mention, you know, in the past couple of years, Ukraine has also destroyed a third of Russia's Navy using sea drones. So I think a lot of this gets missed with our sort of political conversations in America, but the innovation that is happening here with drone warfare is astounding. And, you know, Matt, one thing I saw in the American headlines about this I thought was quite unfair, and the American and the British media, they said that Ukraine has...
Excuse me, Mr. Gaetz. There's a drone attack right now, actually, Mr. Gaetz. I'm looking out my window. Oh my gosh, the explosions, they're spelling something out in the sky. Trump is gay. Oh my God, Trump is gay. Gaetz, we need a direct response on the Kremlin. We need a response now. How will we respond to this disrespect to our dear leader?
Navy using sea drones. So I think a lot of this gets missed with our sort of political conversations in America, but the innovation that is happening here with drone warfare is astounding. And, you know, Matt, one thing I saw in the American headlines about this I thought was quite unfair, and the American and the British media, they said that Ukraine has rewritten the rules of war with this attack. And I say absolutely not. Ukrainians are actually adhering to the ancient traditions of war, where you try to minimize civilian deaths. You know, you think about this attack, there were no direct fatalities on the Russian side as a result of this very precise attack on the tools that Russians have used to attack Ukrainians. And even just a few hours before, on Saturday night, the Russians had a major attack on cities throughout Ukraine, hitting civilians in their buildings. So this is not changing the rules of war. This is definitely changing the tactics of war 100%.
I think it's going to change war forever. I think that forevermore, as a consequence of this battle, the outcome in warfare will be determined by whose robots beat the other side's robots. But
that's not a okay. That's a consequence of just how the wars develop, not this battle. I think he's kind of missing the. Matt Gaetz is missing the point of why this operation is important. You could just describe how whose robots are better than the other side's robots. You could describe that most effectively by just looking at how drones are used to counter drones, i.e., when Russian drones like Lancets or fixed-wing recon drones like the Zala and other ones like that are coming over Ukrainian positions, they send out interceptor drones. And I'm actually going to be filming with those hopefully in the near future. I got to contact an old party buddy, actually. So I'm going to, we met at a party in the woods. Cool dude. I got a contact who they're working with interceptor drones, which means you fly these drones that then ram into other drones. That is an example of how a lot of times it's going to be whose robots are better, who has more robots, who has more interceptors, etc., who can produce more drones. This is something that I'm sure could really benefit a country like China that could have a lot of output and are working on mass drone production, and their facilities are expanding. But what's significant about this is the idea of potentially any force in the world, state or non-state actors, could gather drones, hide them in a remote location, remove themselves from that location, and then set those drones into attack paths remotely once they've already evacuated themselves, instead of having the remote control it from, say, 3, 4, or 5 kilometers away and possibly get captured later. Which not only, the possibility of close-range drone attacks on these important military installations like air bases were still a possibility before. Now it's also safer for the people, if they plan it in this way, who want to engage in the attacks. And I know that means all you need is 20 or 30, 1,000 to 1,500 FPV drones that could be set outside of an air base that contains billions of dollars of military equipment. And that cost effectiveness is going to be useful for any number of state or non-state actors.
I'm curious, after this attack by Ukraine from within Russia, what the spirits are like on the streets of Ukraine. Are people in Ukraine expecting things to get worse or better going forward?
Well, so often, and I think the media, the press has driven this story, whenever Ukraine has a great accomplishment, everyone's told to be very afraid. I see this, Matt, very often with the people that the New York Times and others pay to be their security experts. Their job is to kind of keep people afraid. And so everyone's saying, oh, whenever Ukraine does something good, be ready for something horrible. And we've been through 3 years of this, and we see whenever Ukraine makes a strong move, that actually Russia gets weakened for a time. And one story that often gets missed, a year ago, May of 2024, when Kharkiv was being pounded by the Russians, Joe Biden was refusing to let Ukraine strike back. Finally, under international pressure, whoever was in charge back then said, okay, you guys can hit back in a limited way. And it was crossing a major Russian red line. A year ago from today, really, Ukrainians began to use HIMARS, American weapons, on Russian soil to protect the city of Kharkiv. They crossed a major Russian nuclear red line, and guess what happened? The month of June, there were no attacks on Kharkiv until almost the end of the month. So the city and the country became safer. And so I think everyone here is used to that. And then kind of the nice little bonus in this is that if the Russians wanted to have a major retaliation, well, they would use the bombers. But a third of these bombers have been destroyed. So any Russian retaliation really won't be any different than what we've seen these past 3 years.
Yeah, all of us are worried about this conflict going nuclear. I think every human on Earth is. Do you think that this successful operation on the part of the Ukrainians makes it less likely that Russia will go nuclear?
Well, in one sense, we have, what Ukraine has done, we've seen they've destroyed some of Russia's ability to launch all kinds of missiles, including nuclear weapons. They've done that by hitting Russia's Navy in the Black Sea and by hitting these planes. Now, of course, Russia can still send land-based nuclear weapons. And I think that comes down to, this is sort of the philosophical question that's been behind this. In fact, I think when the Biden administration was in power, their main fear was the nuclear fear. And so Russia could always had the cards over the Biden administration because all they had to do was say the word nuclear and Washington would step back. I don't think that's the case now in Washington. I think, you see that there's a sense that if Russia ever were to go nuclear, not only Beijing and others, but especially Washington would retaliate in such a way that would be not permissible. And I think
I think this was true during the ending stages of the Biden administration too, though. Like the Chinese reports indicate that the Chinese told the Russians, like, Chief, we don't want an atomic incident. And this is because it'd be of benefit for the Chinese, of the Indians, for basically everybody that the Russians are trading with outside of North Korea, for the use of atomic weapons not to be normalized. In China's case, they don't want to see North Korea get off the leash and think that maybe we can reconquer the South if we use XYZ atomic weapon. And they don't want that type of encouragement of instability. And they also don't like the normalization of atomic war because they don't want to see their country get nuked in some spiraling crisis. The Indians, well, when most, atomic experts talk about an incident that could lead to an escalation, that could lead to large scale atomic warfare, they're usually talking about India, Pakistan. So the Indians also have a motivation. Another big importer of Russian energy at a discount, they have a motivation also not to normalize this type of behavior. And as we saw from, the recent India and Pakistan clashes where they both kind of wanted to de-escalate, but they didn't want to be shown themselves being, one-upped by the other, it seemed clear to me that neither of them really want atomic war at this stage. So the normalization of that behavior would be of benefit to neither Pakistan or India. Point is, there's a reason for basically all of the world's major players to keep this international norm strengthened. And the longer we don't use atomic weapons on the battlefield, the stronger this standard, this cultural international norm of atomic weapons not being used for offensive wars gets reinforced. And I think most nation states want to see it to continue to be reinforced.
I think so. The Russia's going to always mention the nuclear card, sort of the weaker it gets, and sure. I think this is certainly so. We should expect that. But I think one thing to really focus on. I've noticed a lot of Americans sort of panicking, saying, "Oh no, we're not ready for this to happen on our soil." And I think one way to kind of get through the panic, for example, here in Ukraine, people are very calm, and every American I know who comes here. Especially when they look at the drone innovation, they're so inspired. With one exception, when defense industry people come here, oftentimes, not all,
right?
Of them,
No, yeah, they don't want warfare to get cheaper, which is what the drone warfare probably means. No, they want it to be as expensive as possible. I've got to leave it there, but I greatly appreciate your reports from really the front lines of this war. Stacey.
Okay, beating Kiev is not really the front lines of the war, but okay.
Safe, and we look forward to check back with you soon. JP Lindsey, independent journalist from Ukraine.
Okay, so if you're curious of how much of an effect this had on Matt Gaetz, here's what he tweeted the same day. Think of how many lives it would have saved if Russia joined NATO instead of Ukraine. Swing and a miss on him. Whether it had any impact on his viewership, which I assume is the goal, to if at least not make them, openly, if not to make them supportive of Ukraine, to make them at least less openly antagonistic to Ukraine. Maybe we're making inroads here. But when you're talking about these figures that you're going to be talking to, man, you are walking up I would say, virtually insurmountable mountain. You should try to convince the most people you can. But man, Matt Gaetz was set against Ukraine from the start. Let me give that a little boop, a little heart there. Okay.